This is a reading from a book called Reading Jazz, which is an anthology book. And the bit I'm going to read is Willie the Lion Smith from his own book, Music on My Mind. One day in late 1919, I was strolling up 135th Street, at that time the main drag in Harlem. 125th Street was then a white neighbourhood, and ran into Baron Wilkins, who hailed me. "Hi there, Sergeant Smith. My brother Leroy is looking for you. He says he needs a good piano player to take charge." I decided to play it sharp. "The name is the Lion, and you tell Leroy to phone for an appointment if he wants to audition me." Since getting out the army, I'd been doing a little gambling, drinking and piano playing in various bars, just like I'd been doing before the big mess in Europe. This will be the 1914-18 war. Before the big mess in Europe had started. After meeting Baron, an old saying of my mother's came back to me. It is far better for the soul to have a crust of bread and plenty of sleep than to have turkey and $100 in your pocket. I decided it might be a good idea to settle down somewhere for a while. The vibration at Leroy's had always seemed good to me. I was living at that time at Lottie Joplin's boarding house. That was where all the big-time theatrical people stayed, and everything was free and easy. Mrs. Joplin was the widow of the great ragtime composer Scott Joplin, who had died back in 1917. She only wanted musicians and theatre people for tenants. The place was a regular boarding house, but sometimes operated like an after-hours joint. She had the entire house at 163 West 131st Street, and it was a common occurrence to step in at 6 in the morning and see guys like U.B. Blake, Jimmy Johnson and the Lions sitting round talking or playing the piano in the parlour. We used to play Scott's Maple Leaf Rag in A-flat for Mrs. Joplin. Before she died, she took me down to the cellar and showed me Scott's cellar full of manuscripts, modern things and even some classical pieces he had written. The Lion decided to have himself a big dinner at the Libya and then go over and talk to Leroy. The Libya was Harlem's high-class restaurant of the day. It was the dictiest of the dicty. They served tea between 4 and 5 in the afternoon and featured dinner dancing until 1 a.m. The music was furnished by a string orchestra made up of members of the Clef Club. They were hidden in a grove of potted plants and were not allowed to rag it or to beautify the melody using their own ideas. They had to read those fly spots closely and truly. We used to kid them about having to read their tails off. During supper, they served the Lion a muskmelon filled with ice cream doused in champagne. Sounds wonderful. These vibrations were too tony for a guy who had just gotten out of the trenches. Leroy's was going to look good to this piano man. When I walked in and announced to Leroy, "The Lion is here," he glared as per usual and replied, "You know where the piano is at. Go ahead and take charge." Back in those days, taking charge meant the pianist had duties and responsibilities. He played solo piano, accompanied the singers, directed whatever band was on hand, and watched the kitty to be sure no one cheated on tips. That cigar box kitty was very important at Leroy's, since the boss didn't allow any coins to be thrown around. Everybody's tips, including those given to the musicians, singers, waiters and bartenders, had to go in the box to be divvied up at the closing time. The piano man was it. the man in charge. He had to be an all-round showman, and it helped if he could both dance and sing. It was like being the host at a party. You're expected to greet everyone who entered to establish favourable feelings. I used to chat with the patrons at nearby tables in order to get their immediate moods. When I'd run into a noisy, rude one, I'd end the set abruptly and holler, "Man, go get lost." The bosses expect you to stay rooted to your stool from 9 at night till dawn. Man, if you got up to go to the men's room, those guys would scream. Leroy would come up wailing, "What are you trying to do? Put me out of business?" And in those days, you worked 7 nights a week. Furthermore, you'd rather piss in your pants than leave the piano when a rival was in the house. That was the best way to lose your gig. Another thing that was different in those days was that you couldn't eat or drink in the joint on the entertainer's discount, yet you were expected to drink all the booze brought to your piano at a customer's expense. To the Harlem cabaret owners, to all nightclub bosses, the money was the one-way shoot, everything coming in, nothing going out. And that wasn't all. In addition to all this take-in-charge service to the establishment, the tickler was required to build up for himself a big following. It got so that whether or not a place had any business was decided by who the piano man was, and there was no advertising done to help. It was your job to draw in the customers. All the owner had to do was count the money. For all this, they paid you off in uppercuts. That was a saying we got in those days. It meant you were allowed to keep your tips, but you got no salary. Sometimes they would give a small weekly amount, like $20. That was known as a left hook. When I started at Leroy's, he acted as though he was doing me a big favour by letting me sit at the piano. After I'd been at the club for a couple of weeks, I noticed the place was packed. It was time for me to have a little talk with Mr. Leroy. So one night I took time out and sent for an order of southern fried chicken, the speciality of the house, served with hot biscuits. Instead of the chicken, I got Leroy hollering, "What the hell do you think you're doing now, lion? Ain't you got any food at home? You trying to take advantage?" I looked calmly round at the crowded room. "I want a small left hook, man, or else I'm moving on." It was common practice for a piano player to keep on the go because you weren't considered too good if you stayed at the same place for too long. It signified you were not in hot demand. Well, my little move was a success. I wound up with a salary of $18 a week plus tips, and I was taking home around $100 a week from the kitty. Old man Wilkins could see which side his bread had been buttered. At Leroy's, they didn't pretend to give out with a fancy show or review. The show actually consisted of the pianist, occasionally accompanied by several instrumentalists, 6 or 7 sopranos, and a bunch of dancing waiters who also sang. Our sopranos could sing any kind of music in the book, or requested by customers. These girls, like the piano player, worked all the cabarets in Harlem and Atlantic City at one time or another. I recall at Leroy's we had Josephine Stevens, Mattie Height, and Lucy Thomas, including a cute little Creole girl from New Orleans named Mabel Bertrand. She later married Jelly Roll Morton. All these girls sang at the tables as well as doing their turn on the floor. On the nights when I had helped to keep the music rocking, we had fun. The helpers were usually a drummer, a banjoist and a violin. Once or twice we had a tuba player. Most frequently it was just a drummer, and we sure had some good ones around New York at that time. Such guys as Carl Battleaxe Kenny, George Hines, Harry Green, George Barber, Freddie Rastus Crump, Charles Buddy Gilmore, the regular drum ace with Jim Europe's Hellfighters, and a lame guy known as Traps. I think his real name was Arthur McIntyre. Traps could make a fly dance with his ratchets. He and Gilmore drummed most of the time in a show band. He was knock-kneed, and like all those people with crazy legs, he was as strong as a bull. Every time one of the girls moved an eye, old Traps would hit a lick. The chicks would tell him, just brush me lightly, politely, slightly, and get soft. Give me the real low gravy. Man, the women sure did love their drumming. When the gals ran out of songs, Trips and I would take over and make up lyrics for them. And talk about blues, we had 'em, chorus after chorus. It was like Ethel Waters once said over the radio, I don't care what you talk about, you talk all about the modern music, but when it comes down to feeling the music, interpreting it, that we can do. We have the gift to send the message, the blues, yeah. To get a short rest from Leroy's, I would sometimes go back to Newark and put in a few weeks at Jimmy Connaughton's on Academy Street, Pearson's Hall, or in the dining rooms at the Hotel Navarro or the Robert Treat Hotel. Several of the times I left to go up 135th Street and help out gambler Jerry Preston, who had just started an upstairs joint called The Orient. I was the first pianist to work for him and talked him into hiring 3 girl singers to make his place into a regular cabaret. It started him off in the business. I worked again for him years later when he ran Pods and Jerry's. He was a genial boss and we always got along. My only complaint was that he hired the damnedest waiters and bartenders. They were a band of crooks. He paid them good salaries and was always firing them for being snooty to the customers. Being a first-rate gambler, he had very good connections. Whenever I would cut out from Leroy's, it was my custom to leave the piano in the custody of a trial horse. In this way, I felt I could get my job back when I came to it to return. My favourite trial horse was a pool shark named Charles Summers. He had been a pianist at Leroy's before I went there to take charge. He was a fair tickler. He could only play in 3 keys, but he made so much playing pool that his piano playing was just for kicks. But there came one time when I really goofed and almost lost the job. That was when I left the stall in charge of a 16-year-old fat boy, whose name I didn't even know at the time. He used to hang around wherever there was a piano on 135th Street. I was told they let him play the box at the Crescent Dime movie theatre down the street when the regular man was off. This was long before the time this kid was bugging Maisie Mullins, the pianist organist at the Lincoln Theatre, to let him play the $10,000 Wurlitzer pipe organ. Yeah, man, I'll never forget how good old Fats, when he was still a stripling, would walk into Leroy's eating one of those caramel-coloured apples on a stick. He was never without one. James P. Johnson brought him down one Sunday afternoon. We were all dressed in full dress suits and tuxedos, and in comes this guy with a greasy suit on. Walks down to the bandstand and says, "Hello there, Lion. What do you say?" He made me furious. I turned round to Jimmy and said, "Get that guy down because he looks filthy." "Get them pants pressed," I said. "There's no excuse for it." From that day on, I called him filthy. So he sat down until I got finished, and when I got finished, he was insistent, very persistent. He insisted he wanted to play Jimmy's Carolina Shout, and when I got through he sat down and played Shout and made Jimmy like it and me like it. From then on it was Thomas Fat Swaller. He sat down also and heard me play a couple of strains of something, and then he improvised, and the next time I turned round he had a tune called Squeeze Me. The Lion was only gone for a few days, and when I got back, Filthy had built up quite a following for himself. You could tell by the ovation he got when he walked in casual-like. I gave him a listening and made my famous prediction. I said to James P. Johnson, who was in the house again that night, "Watch out, Jimmy, he's got it. He's a planner-playing cub." I was listening to James P. Johnson's Carolina Shout to compare the three of them. I listened to Willie the Lion Smith playing it, and he plays some very dense chords, and he plays the tune almost mixed in with the chords, so all you hear is this denseness. And then I listened to Fat Swaller play the tune, and he played a much lighter version, higher up the piano and much, much faster. He's a very fast player. And then I listened to James P. Johnson play it, and he was the one who composed Carolina Shout. And he played it slower than Fats, but he had a lot more going on in it than Fats did. He really knew that tune.